So welcome everybody to this May meetup. Like I said before, we have a couple of new people joining. So I just wanted to go quickly for the presentation. So just quickly about me. So I'm a SharePoint and Office 365 consultant, and I'm going to be starting a new role with TSG in Glasgow next Monday. I've created this group because I couldn't find any that I could attend myself or join even online. So normally we do that at Incremental in Glasgow, but for this month I've decided to do it online because we had 2 online speakers, because last month I had some issues with a remote speaker, and so that was safer this way this time. I'm also a co-organizer for the Scottish PowerShell and DevOps user group, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute. So what is the group about, for those who don't know? So we do obviously SharePoint, online and server as well. It's not dead. Office 365, obviously, PowerShell for SharePoint and Office 365 specifically, and Microsoft Flow and Power Apps as well, because it's part of the bundle with Office 365. So, and as for the categories, I try as much as I can to vary and do some development, administration, security as well, because I think it's really important. Power users and end users, let's not forget about them. And if we can have some real-world examples with the speakers, then it's even better. So the other user groups that I know in Glasgow, so like I said before, the Scottish PowerShell and DevOps user group. So everything is related to PowerShell for everything DevOps. The Glasgow SQL user group, everything obviously SQL, Power BI. I think there's a little bit of Azure and SQL in Azure as well, and the Glasgow Azure user group. So the first 2, if you're interested, with mine, we are meeting every month. So the DevOps and SQL meeting every month, and the Glasgow Azure is meeting every 2 months, I believe. But they don't have a Meetup group, so I think you can find them only on Twitter. This time, I didn't forget to put my slide, so if anybody is interested in being a speaker for the group, or even another group if you want to, you can drop me a message. I'm most of the time on Twitter, but if you're not on Twitter, then just send me a message through the Meetup group messages. So it can be anything you want to talk about within our categories. So for even as low as 10 minutes, we usually go up to an hour. So just drop me a message. I don't bite, I promise. And just proof is that next month we'll have 2 new speakers as well. So just honestly, just feel free if you want to do something, you don't know how to start or whatever, just drop me a line and I'll do my best to answer quickly.
Okay, well, thank you very much for Veronique to actually invite me to kind of speak. So I am a new speaker. I've done a few sessions in the past. This is the first one I've done remotely as well, so everything's a bit new. But yeah, my name's Garry Trinder. I'm a solutions architect. I work for CPS, Office 365 Gold Partner, who I joined on Monday, so it's all a bit new. So both myself and Veronique have got new jobs, so it's all a bit exciting. So yeah, I've been around SharePoint for about a decade now, and moved into Office 365, where I've kind of been working SharePoint Online for about the last 3 years, primarily, and kind of working with kind of Azure as well to build solutions for various customers. Yeah, the talk I'm going to go through today is hopefully how it can help you simplify your provisioning using Azure Automation, PnP, PowerShell, and also a bit of Flow in there as well. So, where to begin? So, in the beginning, this happened to me about a year ago now, where I kind of started work on a project which I'd inherited, which had a very common scenario, which I'm sure most people working in SharePoint have come across, and that's to automate provisioning of some SharePoint online sites. It's kind of the thing that we always do with SharePoint. Someone creates a site and they just want it replicated. You know, it's changed over the years, different ways of being able to replicate sites, and in the kind of the cloud era we're in now, it's all different, and there's all different ways to achieve this. So this project already had a solution, so great. You know, I've got something to provision sites with. But the problem was that it was kind of using quite a few technologies. So yes, it already used Flow, which was great, but it was using queues. It used an Azure function primarily for actually creating the sites. So that was written in C#, and our provisioning templates were actually stored in Azure storage as well. And then, you know, the output was a SharePoint site, but it seemed just a little bit complicated. You know, there was a lot of code that was written, and the first thing that kind of struck to my mind is, well, why can't we use PowerShell? You know, we've got C# here, which is great if you're a developer. It actually kind of fell that when we inherited the project, one of the guys that was working on the project with me didn't have great C# kind of skills, but did have really good PowerShell skills. And we're kind of used to using PowerShell almost on a daily basis with cloud services, whether we're managing Azure or SharePoint. So it seemed a little bit strange that we had to kind of use you know, C# to create these things. So that was the project that I inherited, and it just by off chance I actually attended a Flow hackathon, and it was great. I won first prize for mine, so that was all good. But one of the things that kind of struck me was kind of going to a Flow hackathon. I've done Flow for quite a bit. You kind of think, what am I going to learn? Well, one of the kind of example flows that was shown in one of the demos, I saw a new connector which I'd never seen before. So it kind of sparked my interest. And it was actually the answer to my question. And that little connector was this little guy here, these cogs. Because what I'd found when I started asking questions about this was, okay, so this connector is connecting to a cloud-based automation service. Okay, so that's good for provisioning. It's more administrator focused. Okay, that's even better. It's not developer focused like an Azure function. Then I found it's got native PowerShell support, and it's got native support for the gallery as well. So that was even better. It just made it easy to use modules like PnP PowerShell that I've been kind of using on a daily basis. The connector itself in Flow was also really good, but it was a standard connector. It wasn't premium either. So, you know, it was just a standard license. It gives an area where we can store credentials as well. So that again, that was quite good. In one service, we've got all these features. The other side of it as well, it also supports long-run operations, which obviously is great for provisioning things in the cloud. They take a long time. Provisioning SharePoint sites can take a long time as well. You don't know, how long they're going to take, so you need something there to be able to just keep running. It has role-based access, so whoever has access to this service can run it. if you've not got access, you simply can't get in. And for the developer inside me as well, which is also an added bonus, is that it's got source control support. So the service is Azure Automation. That's what it gives you, and that's what I kind of found out. So what well, before I move on to the demo, so this is the Microsoft kind of approach to what Azure Automation is and what it gives you. It's a little bit wordy. Azure Automation provides you the ability to automate frequent, time-consuming and error-prone cloud management tasks. Okay, so it's frequent, it's going to handle things running on a regular basis, but it's the key thing that it's going to focus on the work that adds the business value, and it's going to boost your efficiency and hopefully, like I say, lower your operation costs as well. Now, throughout all this, I just see this as Azure Automation. Simplest way is how to run PowerShell in the cloud. Is probably the simplest way to describe it, because that's what it does primarily, and that's what it does quite well. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to jump straight into some demos. So we're going to actually go into the Azure portal, and we're going to show you some example scripts that I've written, how it works with flow, some kind of patterns that you might want to use, and yeah, hopefully people will be able to pick this up and use it for their own work. So I'm just going to come out of my presentation and to Safari. Okay, so here I am in my my Azure portal. One of the resources that I've got here is an automation account. So if you want to create an automation account, it's really quite easy. Just type in automation, hit create, give it a subscription, resource group, and obviously location as well. And that's what that's going to do. It's going to create the automation service, which allows you to store your kind of your PowerShell scripts, and also where your shared resources are all going to live as well. So I'm going to go to the one that I've already created, rather than sit here and wait for it to actually finish. So here is an Azure Automation account. On the left-hand side, you can see there's a number of different options. You've got the process automation section here with the runbooks and galleries. What I'm going to come down to is just kind of talk quickly about the shared resources, because I think this is a really powerful benefit of using Azure Automation. If I start with modules first, so the modules are essentially pre-installed PowerShell modules which you can access in your scripts when you run them from this automation account. You get a number of Azure modules without having to do anything. You just get them automatically, and there's a nice little kind of update function, so that as Microsoft push out new versions, you can just make sure that you're using the latest Azure modules. But the one thing that I really do like about this is you can see here I've got the Microsoft Online SharePoint PowerShell module, Power Apps modules, all sorts of different modules that I've just pulled down from the gallery. So there's a couple of ways that you can actually add your own modules into here. You can zip the modules up and you can import them this way. Or if you know that there's a module in the gallery that you want to use, you can go to the Browse gallery. So this is just a nice window into the PowerShell gallery. So if you search for, say, SharePoint, you're going to get all the modules back that can be installed. So if we take the top one, the PnP PowerShell Online, I've already got this installed actually, but if I go into here I can see all the commandlets that I'm going to get when I actually install this. I think I can scroll down. There you are. You can see all the latest commandlets in there, and you can see the version number as well of what the latest is. If you click import, then what it will also do is it will just pull that into your automation account. If it already exists, it will actually upgrade your the modules that you've already installed as well, which is quite good. So it's really easy to just add, update modules as you go along. So if I just come back. So the next section we really want to talk about is credentials. So credentials, storing them is always kind of a hot topic. Whether you're storing them in Azure Key Vault or they are web application settings, they really need to be secured. What Azure Automation gives you is this nice little, again, section that allows you to just add new accounts in there, to put the usernames and passwords in, and be able to reuse these in your scripts. So once that credentials created, the passwords in there, it's all encrypted. You can go in there and you can change it, but no one can actually see it as well, which is a nice little feature that you get by rights. The next section is variables. Again, because they're centralized, all these variables are accessible from within your scripts in the automation account. So anything like application IDs, secrets, you can store them in these variables and then just reuse them. So make sure that you're not storing password, credentials, anything sensitive actually in the scripts themselves. So if I move back up to process automation, because that's kind of like the basics of the shared resources that I've kind of gone through. If we look at the runbooks, so these are essentially, runbooks are the PowerShell scripts. A runbook really is just a parameterized PowerShell script that can be run in this automation account. So I've got a number of them in here, and a couple of them which I'll actually go through. So the first one that we've got here is just hello world. So as I go into here, actually it shows me information as to when this runbook was actually last run. So you get all the logging as well, which is again nice. You can just go to the runbook and see what happened to it, if it completed, if it errored, and go in and inspect that. If I just go to view for a second, so here we see it's really basic. All it's doing is just taking in a single parameter, and it's going to output that parameter as well. So the way that this works is that if I say I go into edit this, I can go to a test pane, and I can actually test this script within the portal itself. The parameters section on this left hand side is all dynamic, so it reads the PowerShell scripts, so it reads the inputs that it requires, and it builds up the test pane. So you can come into here and you can click start, and what that does is it's just queuing this script up to be executed. When this kind of queuing process starts, what's happening behind the scenes is Azure is basically spinning up what's called a worker, and that is the environment of which the script's going to be running. So there's a little bit of a delay whilst that worker spins up, and then executes the script. But you see there, you get the output of the script. Yes, it's really simple, but if I just put my parameter in there and rerun it, it's going to queue that up again, and obviously this time it's going to say hello and my name. So one of the things to just kind of obviously mention is that because this is designed for long-run operations, it's not really designed for really small requests such as this, because of the time it takes to spin up the worker and then execute it. One of the additional things about the Azure automation service as well is that you've got this script that's been run in a sandbox in Azure. You also have the option to actually run that script on a server on your own infrastructure. So one of the things that Azure Automation allows you to do is to set up this kind of hybrid worker. I can quickly just simply show you how that works. I've previously gone and configured a Windows server to have a hybrid worker. I'm not going to go through the process right now, but there's documentation on docs.microsoft.com. I'll share this link later, that shows here how you have your Azure Automation account in Azure with the runbooks stored there, running against the hybrid workers running on your own network that can then access kind of like local resources. So I'll just quickly jump to this server that I've got running. I can show you here. This was a script that I used to actually set up this worker. Again, if you go to that docs.microsoft page, it goes through all of this of how to set that up. It's relatively easy. But what this allows us to do is it allows us to see these worker groups from Azure. So I can choose my worker group, which I've configured beforehand, and I can hit start. What it's going to do now is it's actually going to run it against my my VM running on this machine. And there we go, it's completed. So it's quite powerful in the fact that, well, if I do need to connect to anything that's on my local network, that's not necessarily accessible from the cloud, then I can do that, and that's really powerful for kind of scenarios where you might have SharePoint Online scripts, but you also might have kind of a SharePoint Online, a SharePoint server instance that you might want to run an update against for whatever reason. You can kind of mix and match. The one thing to notice or to note is that when I showed you before the modules section, it was really easy to add new modules in through the Azure portal. That doesn't apply to the hybrid worker. On the hybrid worker, you need to actually go in there and install all the modules that you need, in addition to the Azure ones that you get given. When you actually install the hybrid worker, it pulls down all the Azure modules for you anyway. So it's just one thing to note, but that does give you the option to kind of have different versions running in different areas as well. So that's a very, very basic example of a runbook and using the test pane to actually execute those. What I'm going to do now is just show you how you can access some of the shared resources that I spoke of earlier within the script itself. So on the left hand side you've got this little pane. and you've got access to the variables and also the credentials, which talked about earlier as well. And it's really easy. You can just click and actually get the variable, and that's it. So it's get automation variable and get automation PS credential as well. That's just going to pull in the details for you into the script that you need, rather than it's very simple. You don't have to pull any other modules into the script. You just get those, which this will become more evident later on when I show you some more complex examples of how we're going to connect to SharePoint and then actually provision sites and apply templates and things. But before we do that, what I want to just show you now is how we can orchestrate the execution of this Hello World runbook from Flow, just to show you how you can use a pattern to execute and then get responses from these runbooks. So if I just go into manage my flows, I've got a number in here. I've got this Hello World example. If I go into edit, so this very basic, it's just manually triggered. I have a few actions in here. So the first one, create job. All I did, actually I'll show you this. If I just go to automation, you get 3 connectors. Here we go. So you get create job, get the output from a job, and then get the status of the job as well. So these 3 are the core that you'll use, and the 3 that I'm using in this example. So if we go to create job, so one of the things that I mentioned was role-based access. So the account that I'm actually creating the flow under has access to the automation account and the subscription. So you would go through, choose your subscription, choose your resource group, then choose your automation account, which would then show you the number of runbooks that you actually have available to execute. So the Hello World example here, it's asking for my parameter name, same way as the test pane was, with an added option of wait for job. One of the things to note, this is usually set to no when you first add this create job action. It's worthwhile just turning this to yes, because otherwise it will run in an asynchronous fashion. I don't really want that. I want to create the job and then I want Flow to wait till it goes to the next step. I want it to have completed so that I can go to the next stage and get the status of that job and then determine whether it succeeded or not. So get status of the job, it's again same choices at the top to just choose the automation account and then passing in the job ID of the created job in the previous step. I then use a condition that simply checks on the status of the job just to make sure it's completed. If it is completed, I use the get job output action, again passing in the job ID, and that will return me whatever the output of the job is. But on the no side, if there is a failure, what I want to do is I want to make sure that the flow is failed, so I manually do that by using it's a control action, a terminate action, I believe. Just double check that. Yeah, so it's the terminate control action that I'm using there. So one of the reasons why I'm actually doing the check is because you can end up in a scenario using Azure Automation where Flow will say yes, the action has succeeded, but for whatever reason the script might have failed. So Flow kind of gives you a false positive. It goes, yeah, everything's good, but it's good because it just finished. You need to check the status to say, yeah, it actually finished with no issues. So this is, like I say, a pattern that you'll see in the other examples and something that's quite useful. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly test this, and we're just going to go through this. So I'm going to hit run flow. Done. So it's gone into the first step. You can see it's passing through the parameter as JSON. So there's going to be a little bit of a delay whilst we're waiting for the worker to spin up. So it usually takes a few seconds. There we go, it actually just went all the way through. So let's just inspect that so we can see, look, provisioning state was succeeded, it actually completed fine. If I get the status of the job, we can see it's, again, completed, that's fine. The check, yeah, okay, it was completed, so that's great. We're going to go into the left-hand side, and the get job output is actually pulling back the hello and the name as text. So this is a really basic pattern, but something that you'll kind of get used to when using Flow and Azure Automation. I'm just going to quickly jump to an alternative of this, which is the hybrid version. So I've got Hello World Hybrid here, and I've not got the if in here, I've just skipped that bit. But essentially I just wanted to show you how you could run it against the hybrid worker on your own machine. You just simply put in the name of the worker group, and it will just execute against that machine. So I'm just going to run that as well and just show you that it will actually work, that the machine that is running here, this one, is actually picking up the request from Flow running in the cloud. So the only other way that you'd be able to do this would be to actually set up a gateway to connect Flow to your own network. But Azure Automation allows you to kind of get around that by having these hybrid workers. So that's quite good, because I'm pretty sure that they'll start charging for that sooner or later for the data gateway. So there's your very, very basic example. I'm just going to nip back into to the runbooks, and we're going to start to look at some of the more SharePoint kind of orientated runbooks. So we've got a number of them here. I've got a few examples. Connect as an app identity and connect as credential. I'm just going to go into here and go into view. So as I showed you earlier, I'm using this get automation PS credential to use the account that I've got stored in this automation account, and I'm passing that into the standard connect PMP online, and I'm getting the current web from the URL that I'm passing in. I'm stripping out some of the properties, so I'm just going to have title, server relative URL and ID in there, and then what I'm going to do is, this is the output of the job. I'm converting the web object to JSON, and that's going to come out as my output, which is then quite useful to be reused further down the line in Flow. So if I just quickly jump into Flow, and we'll do the connect as credential. So again, it's very similar to what I showed you before, same pattern, apart from this time we're using a different runbook, and we're actually passing in the URL of a site that lives in my tenant. But slightly different, when we've got the output, what we're actually going to do is we're going to parse this output as well. So I've used the parse JSON action, given it an example payload, and it's generated this schema, so it knows that title, server relative URL and ID is going to come back. Because the one thing to note is the output from the the runbook is always a string, whether it's formatted as JSON. You have to do that yourself in Flow to then be able to reuse that. So this is then quite powerful because in the editor you can see now that we have ID, server relative URL, and title that I can just pick from the dynamic content area. Just done that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to perform this trigger as well, and I'll just show this run through. So again, creating the job, and this time passing the URL through. But what's quite nice about this is that obviously the connection to SharePoint is being performed by like a centralized account. I don't know what account is actually connecting to SharePoint from this point of view. I'm actually using a different account to the account that's executing the flow. So I've got an account that's creating the flows, I've got an account that is executing the flows that has access to the runbook, but the actual connection to SharePoint is performed by SharePoint admin, which is a different account. So that's quite powerful. You wouldn't know, it's quite hidden away as well. If you needed to change this account for whatever reason, then you can do that, and it's not going to cause any problems. This one's taking a little bit longer. Like I was saying earlier, it's the if you're expecting things back in seconds, probably Azure Automation's not what you need, but its purpose is to run things over a long period of time. So it's kind of for non-time sensitive tasks that you want to do. So this is where the demo gods are not going to go well, and this one's going to complain.
Well, just a question for me, meanwhile.
Yeah, sure.
That's okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between the runbooks and Azure Functions? Because when I started to do this, knowing that I have no knowledge about Azure itself, so I started to check this for site designs, right?
Okay,
so
yeah.
I got kind of the same process that you have there, except that in Microsoft Flow I'm not using the connector you're using there, but it seems that people are going back to Azure Functions, because now Azure Functions version 2 and above still get PowerShell, which they didn't for some time. So what's the difference between using the Azure runbooks and Azure Functions and the queues?
Yeah, I suppose it's a good question, because there's no real right or wrong answer. Like I said, when I started looking at this, I was very much looking at functions that were being used in version 1. So Azure Functions version 1 PowerShell was experimental. It was you could get it to work, but it involved quite a lot of manual changes to the Azure function itself. And with it being experimental as well, people, certainly myself, I'm a bit kind of wary as to whether I want to put that in production or not. With version 2, PowerShell is now not experimental. There's durable functions. I think it's in preview still. I don't know if it's gone to GA. But yeah, there's different reasons maybe why you'd want to go down the Azure Functions route. I think when you go down Azure Functions, you've still got to handle some of the credentials yourself, so you might be then using Key Vault to store those. It's a HTTP request as well at the end of the day that you're kind of calling. You can certainly trigger the Azure function off a queue as well. You can do the same for Azure automation. I could have this flow just starting with a queue message as a trigger, and having flow orchestrate things. So it's a real difficult kind of question to answer. I would have thought.
So I can still use the Azure runbook.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that if you're using Azure runbook, it's still PowerShell. It's still the same thing. It's putting parameters in there, so that it should be easy to move that over and into an Azure function if that's where it needs to go. You're still using the same modules. I must admit, I'm not sure about the gallery support in Azure Functions in version 2 and whether that's there. You know, it's pros and cons really. It's just looking at that. It's, you know, certainly not saying, well, you know, replace all your Azure functions with Azure automation. Do it where it needs to be there. It might be that you could use Azure automation runbooks for maybe the heavier lifting, maybe the things that are going to run for a long time. Whereas with the Azure functions, you know, previously the Azure functions were designed for frequent but really small operations. Whether that's changing, that might change, and we might all be moving into Azure functions in the future. But yeah, I'd certainly keep your eyes open for the different options. This is just another one that I found helpful. So yeah. If I just go back to see the test actually succeeded, it was the flow designer that was playing up. Yeah, so this one's gone through, status is completed, we've got the output, so there's the object, JSON that it's outputted, then I can parse this, and then I can use this further down in my flow. So that's a nice little pattern of being able to actually pass more information around rather than just text. If I go back to the to another one of the examples, so we've got one as app identity. So rather than actually using a standard username and password, we might want to connect as a SharePoint app. In this case, I've got a SharePoint app identity that's at the tenant level, that's got permissions to the tenant, that allows me to connect to different sites. Again, we're just using the variable get automation variable commandlet to get the values, passing that into connect PNP line, and then doing the same again, and just repeating that. And all that's really changed is the different runbook that we're calling. But all we're doing is still passing in the URL. The permissions are hidden away from us as well, and it's nice and simple, nice and easy to understand what this runbook is kind of doing, and we can make smaller little runbooks and use Flow to just kind of execute them, get the outputs, and then move to the next one, which is again a pattern that I found quite useful to break all of these processes up. So I've got a couple more examples. So we've gone through kind of really basic connecting to SharePoint. The next one is it's the more complicated one, the actual provisioning scenario. So in here we've got a number of runbooks that are going to be used to actually create a site. So this new PNP site runbook is just going to take the name of the site and an alias. When we complete it, we're going to get the output. And the output of that is actually going to be the URL. We don't know what the URL is going to be because we're waiting for the site to be created. So once we've got that URL, What we're then going to do is we're going to pull in a template, which is actually stored in SharePoint. We're going to pass that content, that XML content, straight into this runbook, the apply PNP provisioning template. You can see a pattern. I quite like to keep my runbooks named as the commandlets that I'm using in PNP. This way I can make the runbooks really small. I can move the actions around if I need it, and I keep everything separate as well. So in some cases I don't like the runbooks to do too much, and it helps for error handling as well. If you know which actual runbook failed, it's easier to diagnose. So moving on again, what we're going to do there is if it's actually failed, I'm going to just fail the job, but this time I'm just going to let it continue. If it's completed, I don't need to do any further checks. So we'll quickly look at the runbooks that I'm going to use, which is this one, new PNP site. So this one's going to get as the credential. It's grabbing the admin URL as well, because we're actually creating the site and the tenant. And here again, we're going to convert the output of the site URL. Site URL is the output of this commandlet here, and we're going to get that. And the provisioning template. So this is slightly different. So we've got the template coming in as parameter. So what we can do is we can save this to the runbook that's actually executing this script, so it's available on the drive that it's running. So we just use this because it's coming through as XML object. It's got the save method on there. We can say save it to the home location, so that when we connect to SharePoint, we can apply the template and direct the path, the local drive, because it's already been downloaded and accessible for us. And just to show you that the template exists, I'll just quickly go to this site. If I could just go to the documents library, I have a template XML here. It's very basic, but yeah, if you've been using PNP templates in the past, it's kind of got the common instances there. All this is going to do is just going to apply this template, and it's going to create a new list called My List in the site, just to prove that it's actually run this template in the new site. So I'm just going to run this as a test.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll try and see if we can get the off one.
And hit run. Okay, so that's going to kick off the job, and that's going to go and it's going to create the site first, and then it's going to apply the template. And if the designer keeps up this time, which it looks like it's doing, yep. So if I quickly go back to here, I should be able to just catch that this is actually running. There we are, so you can see. So now just kind of quickly just look at the logging whilst this is actually running. So we can see here, we know what the inputs are. We can also inspect the outputs. It's not getting outputs yet. Oh, actually, it actually failed. Oh dear. The logs that it shows as well, so PNP is actually saying, hang on, there's a new version available, you might want to actually consider upgrading, but the runbooks actually captured this and actually logged that as well, so that's quite useful. This one Don't know why that's failed. Shouldn't have done. Let's have a look, see why it failed. I'm just going to rerun this one because this has worked every time before.
It's only because you're live now.
I know, yeah, everything's recorded and let's just let's run this one again. So if you can see it completed because I actually did it here the other week when I did this same session. So the output should be the URL here, no exceptions. So let's just have a look again. It should be, yeah, it's running again. Just quickly jump into the admin as well. Oh, so it ran that time. There we go, so it completed, got the output. So you can see all the logs here, it splits all the different types up. And if we go back to the flow, we should see that the template, so there's our site. Got the template from SharePoint, which is shown there, so that's all the XML, and it's passed that through into the provisioning template job, and it's actually finished, and that's fine. So if I just go back to here, we can see that this ran, so we can actually see the whole XML that was actually sent through as well. It's got no output, and one of the things which I do quite like about this is you can get the logs from the progress as well. So when you apply a template, you usually get the progress bar at the top, and it kind of zips through all the different areas of the template that it's provisioning, so fields, lists, all those kind of things. It gives you a running audit of what it was doing here. And it gives you, if there is a failure, it just gives you that extra information to just see where it actually failed, and then you can go in and inspect it, and you're not kind of looking blind and thinking, okay, I've got an exception that I don't know what it means or where it could have failed. So I find that quite useful as well. If we go to the site though. So if I can grab that site from there. So one of the things that will happen, because this happens every time, and I go, oh no, I can't access it. It just shows that I ran the account, but there was a different account that was actually creating the site. Therefore, my account doesn't actually have any access to it. So one of the additional steps might be then to just go in and add additional owners. I can just quickly get around that though and just add myself in. So I have a new site here. So this guy here was the guy that actually, this is the SharePoint admin credential. And this is my account that that I'm using. I'm just going to hit save on there. Just go in. And I can see, click that bit too early, on the left hand side we've got our new list that was provisioned, and it's the most boring list in the world, but it just proves that yes, the template was actually run against the site, and it provisioned the assets. So, like I say, the patterns that I've kind of shown is that yeah, you can use the runbooks to run your PowerShell against SharePoint, get some pretty decent login, use other use Flow to pull in information from other services. So using SharePoint as an example, it's quite nice if you've got a site that's got a lot of XML templates in. You can store those in SharePoint, have them nice and visible, rather than storing them in Azure storage. If you don't want to go down that route, it's just an alternative. But it seems, you know, Flow is the bit that's doing the orchestrating, leaving the runbooks to do all of the creating. So if I just move back to my presentation, where is it? There. So just kind of a bit of a recap as to what we've kind of gone through. So your Azure automation account hosts the runbooks. One thing I didn't do, it does have schedules, so you can set things up to execute on a like a daily basis or weekly basis. So you can do that from in the automation account itself. You can also do the same thing with Flow if you really wanted, if you wanted that visibility in Flow. We've got modules that we can add in from the gallery, and you can upload your own. You've got your shared resources, so that are secured for your usernames and passwords and secrets and so on. Role-based access, so again, you've got to have access to the Azure automation account to then actually execute the jobs from Flow as well. Source control, which didn't quite get into, but there is an option to add in source control, so you can have your runbooks in GitHub or in DevOps now, and you can push your runbook PowerShell script code into a repository, and the Azure automation account will know that there's been an update, and it will automatically update the runbooks code. So the runbook itself, it's very simple. It's just a parameterized PowerShell script. You can execute it in Azure in a sandbox, or you can actually execute that on-prem as well. So you got your inputs, simply as your parameters, your outputs. So anything write output or just output it into the to like the terminal will be pushed out. You've got login, so I've shown the login that you get with all the instances of the jobs that are executed, whether it failed. It shows you all the inputs, the outputs, as well as any other messages that are thrown up in the execution of the job. And you also get the testing pane as well when you're in the portal, which is quite useful as well, to just, you know, not having a machine to actually run them against. You can actually run that straight from within the portal. So we use PnP PowerShell, which is imported from the gallery. Like I say, you can use user credentials or app identity to connect to SharePoint. So there might be the case here that if you've got MFA enabled on the account, you'll probably want to use app identity, because it's not an interactive session. You can't just kind of put your details in as it wants to run. But if you do use app identity, just a bit of warning that there's certain commandlets in the PnP PowerShell that don't support app identity, such as the new PMP site, you've got to connect as actual user to execute that. The PowerShell modules that you get include Azure, so if you need to connect to any Azure resources, you can use those. And we've kind of shown that you can use pass in XML templates in as a parameter, or if you want, because you've got the Azure modules there, if you do want to go down Azure storage, you can use the modules to pull down any directories from there as well. So Flow, like I say, we showed how you could orchestrate that. So yeah, Azure Automation is at the moment a standard connector, so you don't need a kind of a premium license to run these. Useful to use this try-catch pattern. Have the condition to just make sure that you're checking for this completed status, and using the wait for job flag to make sure that the runbook is actually completed before Flow moves on to its next steps. If you want to output JSON for the runbooks, then best use the parse action in Flow to reuse those. And again, when we showed in Flow, you've got the role-based access in there as well. You have to have access to the automation account and subscription to actually run those. So licensing, so this is kind of another touch point, is that the Flow and Azure Functions has become quite a common approach. It seems to have it's caused a lot of furore in the community, in that that approach generally requires a HTTP connection, which will require a P1 license from the 1st of February, which will work out to be £5.30 per user per month. And there's all sorts of, I think it's still a bit of a grey area, where is it any user that that kind of kicks off a flow that uses this connector, or is it just a service account? It needs to be licensed. But in kind of contrast, the Azure Automation account actually works on minutes of execution. So you get 500 free a month, and then it's quite a low cost afterwards for when it's running. So it's different licensing approach completely, but it seems to be something to keep an eye on. They say Azure Automation at the moment, from the Flow side, is is a cheaper way of doing it, but whether it's the best way for your needs is kind of up to you. So Bronnie kind of touched this a little bit earlier with a question, is that Azure Automation and Azure Functions, they can perform the same role. I've just got this slide here that's kind of giving you a bit of a kind of a contrast as to the two different methods. So when I was looking at this, it was very much looking at this from Azure Functions version 1. This is kind of changing as V2 is coming along. So PowerShell and Azure Automation, it's native, it's the first class kind of support. The way that you can work with modules is really easy. The UI is very easy to use, and updating things is not a problem. You've got your credentials all stored in one place. It feels more administrator focused. There's lots of hooks in there for managing virtual machines as well as doing kind of SharePoint provisioning. You can actually see the code as well, which I think is actually quite good in some cases. When I've done C# Azure Functions, the code's hidden away, it's in a DLL somewhere. Administrators wanting to go into the portal and actually view what code is running and what it's trying to do. It's not always possible. And like I say, the access as well, only admins who have access to those runbooks can actually execute them with Azure Functions. They're either tied to queues or they're HTTP endpoints. There's some extra considerations that need to be kind of made to make sure that those endpoints are secured, whether that's with an access code or whether that's with Azure AD authentication. There's just different things to think about. There's pros and cons on either side. Azure automation will be suitable for one scenario and not others. But it's good to have a good idea as to what's out there. So that kind of really concludes my session really. I try and do this stuff quite a lot. Generally talking about this on Twitter. So there's my Twitter handle. I'm also on LinkedIn. There's my blog, which I occasionally put things up on here as well. And the GitHub repository that I've got, there's an Office 365 automation repository in there that's got the example runbooks and a few others that I'm hoping to try and get a standard repository of common scripts together. To just kind of show how you can use Azure automation for different scenarios. So if you're interested in that, pop along and have a look. And if you've got your own and you want to contribute, then any pull requests would be greatly appreciated. So there we go. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Garry. Anybody has any questions for Garry? Just unmute yourself. Don't be afraid.
Don't bite.
So
any recommended reading? Yeah, I've just seen.
Yeah.
So the docs.microsoft.com is actually quite good. I'd definitely go there first. There's a lot of yeah, David was already already on that one. If I can just come out of my presentation here. So so I could probably put this link in the chat. There we go. This one. So yeah, it's a really good resource actually. It's got a lot of information in there. It does explain a lot about the execution process as well of the runbooks. So the different stages that a runbook can go through. How you can use this as well in different areas. So I've only really talked about running PowerShell from a provisioning point of view, but there's also a lot of value in using Azure automation for managing virtual machines as well in Azure. So the scenarios for making sure that virtual machines are compliant. It may be that you might want to run scripts on a regular basis against your Azure AD. For cleanup, for accounts, and making sure that your accounts are all managed correctly. There's lots of different scenarios and tutorials on this left-hand side. So yeah, here's all you're reading really. It really goes into great detail.
We're just going to take a 10 minutes break, and then David, it'll be your turn.
Sounds good stuff. Right.
Okay. See you in 10 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for letting me present to you guys today. I appreciate it. It's always an honor to be able to share knowledge with everybody and collaborate. So thank you for attending. Today we're going to talk about tips from the SharePoint framework development trenches. This is a very collaborative presentation. There's a couple of demos, but by and large, it's just going through a number of tips and tricks and features and hints and things that you guys can use and that we can all use to be better at SharePoint Framework development. So don't hesitate to take yourself off mute and ask a question. I've also got the chat window up in my other screen. So, if you've got a question, don't feel like you can't come off mute, as we, covers a lot of ground and a lot of topics. And so if we're moving on to something and you wanted to go back or you want to wait before we move on to ask a question about a current slide, don't hesitate, like I said, to take yourself off mute and ask the question or post it in the chat window. And interrupt me if I maybe don't see the chat window because I might get on a roll. So don't hesitate. It's meant to be very collaborative. I wanted to point out that Bo Cameron also usually does this with me, but he was unable to get away from a meeting that he had to attend. But I just wanted to make sure he got credit for a lot of his work on this particular topic and presentation. Him and I are pretty close, do a lot of work together, and so I want to make sure he got full credit. My name is David Warner. I work for Catapult Systems, and I'm an MVP. I do a lot of blogging and vlogging, try to do a lot of speaking, working in the community, love collaborating with community members and helping them contribute and working together. So never hesitate to reach out to me via Twitter or email. You can see that there, my Twitter handle and email address, as well as my website, warner.digital. So feel free to reach out. So today we're going to cover a few different themes in the presentation: community engagement, SPFX tooling, development overview and tips, power user tips, SPFX deployment options, and SPFX debugging and management. So we have a few on the call. Just feel free to post in there. Has anybody done and dived in yet pretty heavily on SPFX, or have you been working with it for a while? Are you new? Okay, touched it a little bit about a year ago. Beginner. Okay, no problem. There's definitely a span of things here that you'll hopefully will benefit everybody. So we'll go ahead and dive into them. Pretty new. Okay, Scott, great. Alan, mostly new for me. Yep, keen to know more. Fantastic. A lot of, although it has been out for a while, Classic still kind of rules the world, right, for us. Clients are using it. It's not like the transition from Classic to Modern is an overnight thing. So while there's been a lot of adoption for SPFX, there's still a lot of usage of non-SPFX, non-Modern. So it's definitely new for a lot of folks. So first thing that is good to be aware of when you start dealing with SharePoint Framework is the Patterns and Practices group. You see 3 boxes here. The left one is a link to the community calls. Every week there is a community call. This week there happens to be 2 community calls because there is a monthly call as well. So the second Tuesday of every month is the monthly community call where they kind of bring out and highlight all those that have contributed. And every one of you have an opportunity to contribute, get your name on that list, which is pretty awesome. In fact, this month was the highest number of contributors in history that's brought out today. So that link down there, aka.ms SPP&P, will take you to the list of community calls. These are really like crystal balls into the future of what is coming for SharePoint, because we see demos and previews of what is coming soon, and so it's well worth its time. I do a screenshot summary every week because it is an hour-long call, so not everyone can attend or even watch the video recordings, so they do record them and replay them on YouTube. So they're fantastic to watch, but not everybody has the time to do that or all the time at once to do that. So I also do a screenshot summary so you can catch that. I tweet out that every week, and it's also on my blog. The GitHub repositories that you see there, github.com/PNP/SharePoint, those are repositories that have samples that are available to everyone for free. So whether it's working with PNP web parts or extensions, or if you're starting to get into list formatting, which I do a lot of, there's a lot of free resources and issues lists there that you can post questions in and stuff like that, which leads us to our third box, which is the dev docs. So if you go to aka.ms/spdev/issues, it'll take you to the dev docs repository in GitHub for SharePoint. And that issues list right there, you can go in, you can search. It's helpful to find things that you may have had questions about in the past, really all about SharePoint Framework development. So it's the 3 of these together and more really comprise the patterns of practices. team, and it's so much valuable free content, especially if you're just getting started. It's fantastic to get involved and to be part of the community. So definitely take advantage of these 3 things for sure. All right, so let's jump into SharePoint Framework tooling. So how many of you have looked at SharePoint Framework and thought, holy cow, what do I pay attention to first? We've got TypeScript, we've got Gulp, we've got Yeoman, we've got Node, then we've got frameworks and libraries like Angular, Knockout, React, or jQuery, and then there's VS Code, and it can be overwhelming. It can be very overwhelming, so you're left with the question, what do you focus on, right? Of all these things, what is the one that you should focus on the most? Well, I can tell you that TypeScript is the one that you would want to focus on the most. Yeoman and Gulp, Node, those are all things that support the packaging and the bundling of the SharePoint framework, but you could literally get by knowing 1 or 2 Yeoman commands, 3 or 4 Gulp commands that are all within the documentation, and almost nothing about Node, really, from a command perspective, other than knowing how to package your SharePoint framework solutions, whether it be a web part, an extension, or one of the new library components that are currently in preview that are very cool too. So really, if you're looking to what to focus on, where do you put your energy in terms of learning, is TypeScript. And what is TypeScript? Well, it's just a superset, strongly typed version of JavaScript. So if you're comfortable with JavaScript, you can still write JavaScript within your SharePoint Framework solutions. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. TypeScript just provides a lot more safety nets around that to ensure that when things get bundled at runtime, you have less errors. Because JavaScript was very forgiving when you were programming, it didn't really necessarily care if you were utilizing a variable as a Boolean or a string or a number, and you could make mistakes, and at runtime was the only time that you found out about that. TypeScript really tries to help that in ensuring that there's strongly typed languages so that when you define a variable that is a Boolean, you can say it's a Boolean. And if you were to try to use it otherwise, elsewhere in your code, you would get a warning before you ever were able to ship that out into production. Yeoman and Gulp are other supporting technologies on the open source market that help that, but again, TypeScript is really where you're wanting to probably spend a bulk of your time learning about the SharePoint framework. Now, when you talk about installing the SharePoint framework, all of those things do get installed: Node, Gulp, Yeoman, TypeScript. And depending on how you develop, you may not be able to install all those things. Well, one of the options for development where you can create isolation is Docker. Docker is like a VM, if you will, that you can install. All you would need to do is install the Docker Windows client. And then using Docker, there's no local dependencies you need. You don't need to install Node or Gulp or Yeoman. You would still obviously install VS Code for your code editing or anything else. You don't have to use VS Code. But the beauty of Docker is that it lets you, as it says, switch between SharePoint Framework versions almost instantly. And the SharePoint Framework versions do get updated, but sometimes you may be working with solutions that are using an older version. So it allows you to maybe test new versions of the SharePoint Framework without messing up your environment because it is an isolation. So you start what's called images, or create what's called images, and so you have your host OS, then you have Docker, and as you can see here, you might have 2 different versions of the SharePoint framework with different versions of Node and different versions of Yeoman, and you can isolate them completely, and it has very low memory. It only has to run on a couple of gigs of RAM, so it's very low memory, fast startup time, and then you can swap between different versions of the SharePoint framework or other open source libraries pretty much immediately. It's very fast. Some, though, don't necessarily like Docker. When you use Docker, it may conflict Docker image. So so the nice thing is Docker has a repository called the Docker Hub. Gary asked a question, is there a Docker image that you would recommend? So you kind of want to create new Docker images every time a new SharePoint framework version comes out. That way it allows you to have access to that. And the images can be stored and you can swap between those images pretty quickly. Waldeck MasterCards has one. I have one. The nice thing about the Docker Hub is that it's free, so you can go put your images there or reference someone else's images. And there'll be links here that we can provide. I can even provide the full slide deck here to host somewhere and provide some links. But it's I can get that to you, Gary. Sometimes some folks don't necessarily want to use Docker. There are times where it can kind of conflict maybe with Hyper-V. If you're using Hyper-V, there are times where it could potentially conflict with Hyper-V. Another option for isolation is what's called NVM. NVM stands for Node Version Manager, and it is mostly used for changing between versions of Node, as you kind of see in the graphic here. The Node version support for SharePoint Framework doesn't change too much too often, but the nice thing about NVM, which is available on Linux, it's actually more powerful if you're using a Mac or Linux. If you're on Windows, you could get the NVM for Windows. The only thing you need to install is NVM for Windows. And then through NVM, you can install multiple global packages, because with Node, there are Node modules folders that live at a global level and the local level. And so NVM allows you to have different instances at the global level based on the Node version that you've installed. And so within that Node version that you install using NVM, you can actually install different global packages. So that also allows you to install a different version of the SharePoint framework. If you're using non-Windows, as I note down here in the bottom, if you're using Linux or Mac, you can actually use aliases. So an alias is really, as we know, just a nickname, right? And so you could create a nickname install of Node SharePoint Framework and maybe base it based on your SharePoint Framework version. So you could have an NVM installation available that is based on the SharePoint Framework version of 1.8.2, 1.7, or whatever it is that you want to include. And then switching between those is super, super easy. And again, the only thing you need to install is NVM. You don't need to install Node specifically. In fact, when you do go install NVM, if you have Node already installed, they ask you to remove it because it will have problems. Any questions on the emulation of NVM or Docker? Any curiosities or questions? And again, feel free to type it in or take yourself off mute.
Sorry, David, I was just going to say, I guess, which one do you prefer? Do you pretty much think that the Docker route is really the route to go down from your experience?
It really depends on preference. I actually use both, and there's no particular reason why I use both. I've started using more NVM lately for Windows because I'm doing a lot of library components, and with Docker, it's a little more complex if you need to kind of scaffold out or serve up multiple solutions at the same time. And I tend to do that with library components, where I've got the development of my library component as well as the development of my web part or extension all running at the same time. And as I'm making changes to each, I need them to gulp serve and rebundle and repackage. Docker is very specific to, you can create a Docker image that is based on exactly what you know is there. With Node or NVM for Windows, you have to get a little more creative. Like I said, it only allows you to separate between the version of Node. So what I will do is, for example, 8.16, they just released one SharePoint Framework 1.8.2, which supports a higher version of Node, which is 10. But up to that period, it was always version 8 that they supported. Well, within version 8, you've got 8.11 dot something, 8.12 dot something, 8.13. So I would create my own little cheat sheet, if you will, and I would say, okay, my NVM for Windows for Node 8.16 is going to include SPFX whatever. And then it's also going to include this other stuff. And I would kind of keep my own little ledger, if you will, of what each of my installations, which is where if you don't have, if you're using non-Windows, you're in a way better spot for NVM, right? Because you can create that alias that you can call whatever you want. Like Andrew Connell created one when he was up at Microsoft in the Dev Kitchen that he called Dev Kitchen. And so you can get creative with what you call it, and you can include whatever you want. I had to, with Windows, I had to be a little more verbose in my record keeping. if you will.
Okay.
But yeah, they're both good. It really depends on your needs. I think that some have had trouble with Docker because of it was grappling with Hyper-V in the past, and or they couldn't turn Hyper-V on or something like that. I like them both. I just have been using a lot more of NVM for Windows lately.
Okay.
Great question,
cool.
though.
Yeah.
Okay. The next tip is PNPM. So when you go and create a new web part or extension, or library component for that matter, one of the first things you do is you scaffold it out, and it downloads a huge amount of node modules. And your folder, your node modules folder, can end up in the 300 to 400 meg range just for a single web part or extension. And then as you imagine, start working on other web parts or extensions stored in other areas of your hard drive, that can actually start adding up really fast, and your hard drive space starts shrinking all of a sudden. Well, with PNPM, you can actually create a cached library of your node modules. So now when you go to scaffold out, for example, a new web part, you can tell it to use the PNPM library, which is a store that stores on your hard drive all of the different node modules that you download. So the first time you download them, it is a true download. You're installing node modules, you're downloading them, but what you're also doing at the time of using PNPM is you're caching them into a global store on your computer. So what happens is it creates these symbiotic links, if you will, or symlinks from your node modules, local node modules folder for your web part or your extension or your library component, and points at this global store or global cache that also resides on your hard drive. So the next time you go to scaffold a web part using the PNPM, instead of taking maybe 10 minutes to scaffold out the node modules, it might take less than a minute. And so it's a little faster if you find that you're dealing with a lot of creating new web parts or new extensions, or maybe perhaps you're working in a big development team where you're constantly going back and forth between different solutions. It can save time from that perspective. So, and in the end, you get much smaller project folders, and as it brings out faster creation of new projects. So it's interesting and well worth looking into if you've not used it before. Using PNPM works fine with NVM for Windows as well, so they work fine together. And I've been playing with PNPM for Docker. It's a little more unique for Docker because in Docker, when you use Docker and you spin up an image, it's a read-only entity, but it includes your global node modules. And so writing to there can be a little bit problematic, and so I'm kind of playing with seeing if there's a way to make it work with Docker. But if you use NVM for Windows, it definitely works great, very, very powerful, and it helps keep your project folder small and faster creation of new projects. PNP Yeoman Generator. So when you're creating new web parts, usually the documentation shows you to go use the Yeoman generator, the SharePoint Yeoman generator. This is built on top of the out-of-the-box Yeoman generator. The PNP Yeoman generator is. It uses the actual Yeoman generator behind the scenes from Microsoft, but gives you access to a lot more that is included. So when you go scaffold out a new web part or an extension, you're really only given no JavaScript framework. I think Angular and React, I think maybe, or maybe handlebars or something like that. I forget what all is included. Actually, I don't think it's handlebars. I forget what all is included right out of the box. But the Yeoman generator gives you access to a lot more, like Vue and Angular, jQuery. It's also getting built to include jest testing, so you could include testing. It's completely open source. It is supported by Microsoft, being part of the PNP team, which is governed by Microsoft. There's no rogue building going on here or non-best practice, if you will. So it gives you access to a lot more spun up out of the box, and it also includes the Office 365 CLI, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So if you're looking to build new web parts or learn, it's definitely worthwhile looking into the PNP SPFX generator because it does include a little bit more out of the box. In fact, it's getting to the point where Microsoft is starting to recommend starting with the PNP SPFX generator when you're building new solutions as opposed to just the out-of-the-box one because it is becoming so robust and including a lot. All right, that covers a lot of the tooling. Any questions on tooling or kind of getting started with SharePoint Framework, or you might want to focus your time? Okay.
Don't worry, David. People can ask at the end or even put it on the chat. So don't worry for that.
Okay, absolutely. So let's talk about the development overview. So what are your solution options? You can deploy out using SharePoint Framework, feature framework stuff like lists, libraries, content types, site columns. From a solution perspective, you've got 3 choices in extensions. So application customizers, those are things that are going to provide global level development, like if you want a header or a footer. Command sets allow you to have buttons within things like lists and libraries. And field customizers, which allow you to override the display of a field, sort of like JS Link was in Classic. If anybody used JS Link in Classic, which I used a lot of, it kind of provides that a degree of development, but not as much. There's not quite yet the ability to override the editing experience of a field in the modern experience using a field customizer. So hopefully that'll come soon. They've got us halfway there. I know personally I'm hoping for that because I've created some pretty in-depth JS Link solutions that provide a very rich interactive experience for selecting data, like icons, but that's not necessarily as easily done with field customizers now. And of course, web parts. So you can create web parts. One of the newest things that isn't out of preview yet, but is available in preview, it's not out to GA, is library components, and we'll get that added in here once it goes GA. But that is available in preview right now, so you could start playing with them. Library components allow you to bundle up existing code that you may be using and deploy it out to your SharePoint tenant, and then web parts can hook into that and extensions can hook into that, and that way you're not having to bundle them in your library and you're not having to host them externally in like some CDN or a list or library. So library components are pretty powerful. So let's look at some tips. How many of you are still working with Classic SharePoint? So how many of you are having to deal with either internally to your organization, connecting to Classic SharePoint sites? Yep, Michael, sounds like you are. Good. Or your clients, right? I think it's pretty much all of us. Now, how many of you often find yourself needing to use SharePoint Designer if you're going to go in and edit things like CSS or JS, right? Probably a number of us. Some will go in and download the CS or JS directly to their hard drive, make changes, and then send it back. And I think it's safe to say that none of us are probably huge fans of SharePoint Designer. It's probably not your favorite code editor if you're writing any JavaScript or CSS. But what I do like about it is the ability to connect it directly to a SharePoint site, edit that CSS, edit that JavaScript or any other files, right? We may have JSON, we may have some other degree of file stored in our Classic SharePoint site that we need to edit. And really, connecting to SharePoint Designer, editing that code or file, and saving and knowing that it's saved immediately back to SharePoint, it is convenient. But working within SharePoint Designer and its limited use of IntelliSense and its frustrating interface is not fun at all. So did you know that you can connect VS Code or Visual Studio Code, which is free and cross-platform, available on Mac, Linux, Windows, you can connect that directly to your SharePoint sites, be it classic or modern, edit said JavaScript or CSS or any other file, and see it saved directly back to SharePoint. So the cool thing about VS Code is it includes extensions, and one of those extensions is called SP&O. And so I'm going to show a demo of that right now, actually, and we'll see how that works live. So I'm going to bring up a SharePoint site. This is a classic SharePoint site right here, and it just has, in the style library, source files. And I'm going to bring up my folders and VS Code. Now what we want to do is we want to connect to the SharePoint site, have access to our styles and scripts, edit them, and know that they were changed back directly in SharePoint. So what I typically do is when I know I'm going to be using SP&O, which I'll show you over here, if you come into VS Code and you just do a search on SP&O, you'll see it show up right here and I'll close this. And you just install it. It's very easy, it's free, and it has some good documentation here. I've actually done videos on how to use it, but it's completely free and very, very powerful and easy to use. And I'll show you, we'll continue on how to do that now. So what I typically do is if I know I'm going to be connecting to a lot of sites, I'll just create a little section for myself called SP&O somewhere, maybe in my OneDrive or whatever, and I'll label it my tenant.site name. Because what you're going to do is within each of these folders, you're going to download files from your site. So in this case, we're connected over here to a site called Community Classic. It's a classic site, but again, this works with modern. And so I'm going to go ahead and open up Community Classic, and I've already got a SP&O in here. It's just a placeholder, allows me to copy and paste some stuff so I don't have to retype it, but we'll show how to use it from the very beginning. So I'm going to open that in Visual Studio Code, which I've already done. And now I've already installed the extension, as you see, and we'll go ahead and close that. So if I want to go ahead and create a new connection to my site, I'm going to copy the URL here, and I'm just going to go ahead and hit F1, and that brings up your command center. And I'm just going to type SP&O, and I'm going to select SP&O, and you can see there's a number of options available for us. I'm going to say Configure Workspace. And so what it's going to do is it's going to bring up a series of questions. It's going to ask me, okay, what's the URL of the SharePoint site you'd like to connect to? So I'm going to go ahead and give it my Pop Warner tenant Community Classic. And it's going to ask me, when you make changes to your files, what would you like me to do? And for this purpose, we're just going to go ahead and select Save and Keep Editing. But you can see that there's other choices, create a minor version, a major version, or do nothing. So we're going to select Save and Keep Editing, and then it asks for an authentication format. What do we want to use for authenticating? And in this case, we're just going to go ahead and use Digest, which is what's used for Office 365 instances. Now what you see it's done is it's created over here an SP&O.json, and it's just including the information that we just told it. The URL, save only, which is what we want it to do when we save, and authentication type. Source directory here, you could change this, but essentially when we download files, it's going to put all those files into a folder here called source. You could change this if you want, but we'll just leave it to be exactly as it is. Now what we haven't done though is told it what it is that we want and where we want to get it from. We know that we've told it the site, the Community Classic, but we haven't really told it that we want to get files from Style Library or from the source files folder within Style Library. So the reason I keep this guy around is because it's easier to copy and paste than type, but we're going to include, and all this is in the documentation, we're going to include a command or a property here called remote folders. And we're telling it, hey, go over to our Style Library and go into the SP&O folder, which I guess there we go. SP&O demo, that was in the wrong folder. SP&O demo, same thing, scripts and styles, and go there and grab everything below it that is a CSS and a JS. And we only have the two, so that's fine. And so now we're going to go ahead and save that, and we're going to go back to our command window, F1, and we're going to say populate local workspace. And what it's going to do is it's going to ask me to authenticate. So I'm just going to go ahead and say David at popwarner.onmicrosoft.com. And it's going to ask me for my password. And you'll notice down here in the lower left-hand corner, it's saying populating workspace. And that just went away. And now we see what's been added is our source folder, which we defined we wanted to be right here. And it includes Style Library, SP&O demo, which is the folder I created here, and scripts and styles. Okay, so it's now pulled it down. And if I wanted to go ahead and go into styles, and now we've got the richer interface of VS Code, right, which is nice. I mean, when you do things like color, it shows you a little color block, and it actually has true, valuable IntelliSense. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up styles here in the browser window. And just so you know, there's no sleight of hand. It is mirroring exactly what I've got over here. And I'm going to go ahead and just create body. And I'm going to say color purple. And then I'm going to save. Now, depending on the time, and we could just refresh this, if we want, but what's nice about SharePoint Online is you can see it actually asynchronously just updated the view for us, and it was added. And this is directly at SharePoint. We are directly connected into SharePoint. If I was in SharePoint Designer, I could refresh the page and you'd see it right there. And so I'm now able to connect to my classic sites and download the files that I may need to work with and edit them in a real interface, a real IDE, which is nice, development environment, and you can see that it's going to reflect immediately. Same thing if I were to go into my styles and make changes. Now, what's cool is you don't have to keep these here either. This is just cached. It's a one-way connection, if you will. What I mean by that is if I were to come into my source right now and delete that and tell it to, hey, just get those files out of there and move them to my recycle bin, it doesn't make any changes to SharePoint. So I've deleted the files locally, but if I go ahead and close my file here and refresh, you'll see that nothing's been deleted. My files still live in SharePoint. There's preservation. We can see the one I just changed yesterday about a minute ago. The other one when I was just testing everything out. Yesterday it was done at about 12:52. But deleting them here from my local source does nothing to my files on my server. So there's no worry about accidentally deleting. The only thing that happens is when you save, it will update the files. It's pretty powerful, and again, as I mentioned, it works with both classic and modern. So definitely, if you are not using RIP SharePoint Designer, yeah, I tell you, it's you know, I don't know if anybody is Monty Python fans, but it kind of feels like the Holy Grail scene, right? Bring out your dead SharePoint Designer. I'm not quite dead yet, just doesn't want to let go. Doesn't want to let go. So, can you add new files that way? You know what? That's a good question. I do not know. Let's try it out. Let's actually try it out. I've not played with that side of it. I'm usually, to populate the workspace again, I'm usually just editing stuff I've already added. So if I come in and say new file, say demo.js, and actually let's make this easier. Just close that. I'll say body. And we'll save that. Let's see if we, yeah, you can. It just went ahead and added it. And you know, I may have tested this before actually. But yeah, so you can actually completely interface through there. And if we open that guy right there, then we see the orange has been added, and I can come here if I want, delete that, close this, refresh, and nothing's been actually deleted. It's all still good to go. So pretty cool tool. I really like it. And that's why, as I mentioned, I've kind of set my environments up this way so that I know I'm going to be connecting to them pretty regularly. You can just come in. Here's a community site I have. This one is modern, so this site is actually modern, and I just right-click and select Open with Code, and I'm immediately inside of it and able to interact and start editing and saving. And the only thing you want to be careful about is if you do cache your files here, like I have on Community, you want to usually do a populate workspace just to make sure you're getting the most recent version. It's useful to do that. Any questions on SP-Go? All right, let's go back, but definitely go use it if you haven't already. All right. So when you're developing a new web part or extension, I had mentioned that you know, when it comes to learning all these new tools like Gulp and Yeoman, these are the 4 commands that you could probably get by only knowing. npmi, which is npm install, and then gulp clean, gulp bundle, ship, gulp package solution ship. There are variations of that with or without the ship that allow you to continue to do development. But really, those are the ones that you'll use the most. If you were to download one of the samples from the GitHub repositories with SharePoint, you would download them, you would do an npm install, and then as you're working, you would do a clean or a bundle or a package, and then you're done, depending on what it is that you need. So I had mentioned that those are the ones that you need to know the most. And you can literally get by without knowing anything else about Gulp if you wanted to do just regular SharePoint development. The cool thing about SharePoint Modern experience is that it is built from the ground up to be inheritance friendly. And what I mean by that is we've got very cool features for theming within SharePoint Modern Experience. You can swap between themes very quickly in a SharePoint site. If I were to go back to my site here, we'll just go ahead and look here, and if I were to go to change the look, and I go to theme, you can see I can change between themes pretty quickly and easily. It's very, very simple. In fact, I'd never even changed the first one. So if I were to say I want to go here, you can see it's going to change to orange there. Or if I want to change to the purple and orange as opposed to the orange and purple, you can see it's changing there. It's very cool and very dynamic, right? So it makes it very easy to change themes, maybe even based on an event that's happening within our organization or the start of fall or something like that. What you want to make sure you do is that you inherit those. Your web parts and your extensions, as you're building them, can inherit those theme colors. So you never want to start thinking about hard coding colors into your web part unless there's a very specific reason that something means something, and even then you might want to use CSS colors to change it. But the point is here, you can see I'm using the exact same web part on the left as on the right, but the theme has changed. And you can tell that because the text color is different, the line is different, the publish button is different. And so it's very powerful being able to inherit those colors across. Because if you were to hard code, for example, the blue, and they had selected this more orangish, reddish theme color, it stands out like a sore thumb and just doesn't provide a very good experience. And so you want to be able to do that within your web part by using these theme tokens. So in your CSS, when you're working within a particular web part or extension and you're creating your CSS or SAS for that, you can identify things like theme primary, theme secondary, and provide a default backup. So it's very powerful to make sure that you're always setting that up to inherit. So that's another tip. Some that are new don't really think about as they're building their web parts. You want to be able to do that. You see up here it's using theme dark as opposed to theme primary. And so those are all included as part of the palette of the theme. Any questions on theming or coloring? Feel free to drop it in. I'll just go ahead and move on. The other solutions that are available to you through the GitHub repository are these reusable controls. So as you're building, you do not have to recreate the wheel every single time. The property pane controls, as you know or may not know, with SharePoint Framework, you control the configuration panel of your web part. So in Classic, we really didn't, especially in SharePoint Online. You had to be on-prem, and then you would have to create it with server-side code, and it was not easy. But if you were in SharePoint Online in the Classic experience, you had no control, absolutely no control over the configuration panel of your web part because you weren't really putting up any full trust code into the cloud. But now with SharePoint Framework, you can. You have full control over the property pane and the configuration panel. And Microsoft provides, and the community, I should say, provides a collection of property pane controls that you can use to just reuse, things like drop-downs and selectors and pickers and stuff like that. So always check here. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you use React, there's a lot of React components that are available. As you can see, there's a chart control and a mapping control. So again, you have a lot more benefit to, or a lot more access to beneficial solutions and resources than we ever had with Classic. PNP.js, if you've not heard of this, we're actually looking for people to help out with it, but it is, I kind of call it jQuery for SharePoint. We all got very comfortable and liked perhaps jQuery because it made things easier, less verbose. It just kind of packaged stuff up for us really nice and easily. PNP.js does the same thing. It's something that you can include and utilize in your web parts, and so when you think about making a REST command or a REST call out to SharePoint to get things like a list, it was always more verbose and it wasn't exactly the most enjoyable to write. But you can see here it's much simpler when you're using things like PNP.js. You've got, once you make the connection, you literally just do sp.web.list.getByTitle, the name of your list, and you can see you start selecting items, select title in this case, and then we can see it expanded out a little bit more down here. It uses promises and async, so it's a lot faster. And you can identify filters, top, It's got asynchronous built-on promises, built-in caching. So if you're connecting to a list, for example, but that list data really doesn't change very often, and you don't want to necessarily export to something like a JSON file, you still want to always connect to the list, you could use caching. It's got built-in caching, so you can identify that. It's extremely powerful. So pnp.github.io /pnpjs. If you're looking to start developing web parts or extensions that are going to need SharePoint data or need to connect to your SharePoint data for something, definitely check it out. The other useful tool from the community is the Office 365 CLI. This is if you are not on a Windows machine and you're tired of hearing about all the people that have all these cool PowerShell commandlets, this is definitely for you. It is available for Windows, Mac, and Linux, so it is OS independent. It is not only for one or the other, but it provides all kinds of management for your Office 365 tenant. You can do all kinds of stuff. Now, the coolest thing, in my opinion, is this guy right here. In fact, Stefan Bauer just did a demo of this today. It's not anything new, but a lot of people don't know about it, and so he did a demo of it on the PNP call today. You can actually get a collection of commands and, in fact, a copy and pastable script from the CLI when new versions of the SharePoint framework come out. So if you built, for example, a web part using, say, 1.6, SPFX 1.6, 1.8.2 just came out, you can actually, the tooling may have changed, the structure of the solutions may have changed. You can actually run the CLI, point it at your solution, tell it to give you an upgrade path to the newest version or a specific version. You don't even have to just accept the newest version. You may be at, for example, 1.4.2 and need to go to 1.6 because maybe your organization is only supporting up to that high level. You can do that. And it is also compatible with Docker. So if you decide to utilize Docker, you can do that. It is definitely compatible with NVM as well, whether you're using Windows or otherwise. But that is one of the biggest features of the CLI, so definitely take a look at that. And there's the URL for it. How are we doing on time? Okay.
I have a question about the CLI there, David. So would that be something that I would use mainly because I'm not on Windows regards to PowerShell?
Not necessarily. So if you're not on Windows, then definitely, because you're not going to be able to utilize PowerShell. Yeah. But if you are on Windows, I still use it. I use it for various things, specifically the upgrade. That to me is fantastic. And well worth the price of admission. But it has a huge amount of community support. Waldeck heads this one up, and they're also looking for people to contribute. So yeah, it's not, definitely if you're not on Windows, this is a must. But even if you are on Windows, there is still a huge amount of benefit to utilizing it.
So just from a non-dev perspective, is there a reason why the commands are different? I mean, it's not very intuitive if we just come from a PowerShell background, I mean, just looking at the screenshot there, for instance, because I tried this, but I was like, it's like learning another, language for doing the same thing.
Yeah, some of the language is different, and there's not complete parity between the PowerShell world and the CLI. Some of that just comes down to bandwidth. PowerShell has been a little more, obviously, being a Windows thing, and Microsoft owning Windows has had a longer history of development. I wouldn't say there's probably anything the CLI can't do that PowerShell can do, maybe. And some of it just comes down to bandwidth of time for resources and support from the community to get the features updated. But the fact that they're named differently, or that they're, for example, I had created a tool for deploying list formatting JSON. And it uses PowerShell through Visual Studio Code to, if you're in the middle of working on a list formatting definition, and you want to, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, we'll talk, if you want to deploy that out without having to copy and paste it, that's what this tool does, right? Well, the PowerShell used a specific PNP command to do that, and it worked perfectly. I just press a keyboard keystroke on my keyboard, and it refreshes and sends it up to SharePoint, and everything's good. I reached out to Waldick and said, hey, does the CLI have this? He said, you know what, it doesn't, but over the course of the weekend, he added it. And so it just came down to it hadn't gotten there yet.
Okay.
And so, yeah, there's because they're different, there's not always going to be a complete parity between them, but I think they're trying to get there, and people can help get there.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Cool. So one of the other things you can do is while you're developing, you can set up environment variables. And so essentially this allows you to do mock data. I won't get too much into this because I know we're running out of time and we've got some other things to talk about. But it allows you to mock whether or not you're in Classic, you're locally running, you're doing testing, and so it's worth looking into if you get into the need of needing to emulate a particular experience. Maintenance mode, this is valuable. You can put this at the end of any page, and it gives you information about your the items on your page, if you will. So where the web part bundle is hosted, as it brings out any external scripts, a version of the SharePoint framework, it kind of gives you the wizard behind the curtain view when you're working with SharePoint framework web parts. You kind of see what's going on. When you do build your web parts, what it does is it creates a JavaScript file, because no matter what happens when you're using TypeScript, it still transpiles it. What it's called is transpiling it down to pure JavaScript, and that's really what's getting run when your web parts are running on a page. And so if you were to do something like include jQuery in your web part, well, now every single time that web part is on a page, even if there are multiple versions of that web part on a page, that version or copy of jQuery is going to get loaded more than once, which one of the things the library component solves. But you can still potentially need access to something like that within your web part, but you don't necessarily need it at load time of the page. It might be something that you don't need access to that jQuery or that library. Maybe it's moment JS until later when someone has maybe clicked a button. You can do dynamic bundling or optimized bundling, and that allows you to now separate those out into a more asynchronous connection using promises. I created a sample for this. I've actually got 2 or 3 samples now in the repos for web parts and CSS, library component. So you see here we've included jQuery, but it's something that I only need at a particular time when a user clicks on a button. So now when the web part loads, the only real load at load time is this 1K file. And then the 87 kilobytes, well, that's jQuery. It's going to get called in, but only when a user clicks a button. So there's definitely some benefit that we can do when we're building our web parts or extensions to be more performant friendly. We can do that to make sure that they're running as optimally as possible. Contents equals 1 for modern world. Yep, very similar, Gary. By the way, on the maintenance mode thing. List formatting, if you guys have not seen list formatting, this is super powerful. It's not necessarily SharePoint framework, but it'll make you feel like a developer. It's very cool. It comes in a format of column formatting, so we can override an individual list column and how it looks. And so if I wanted to now take the Twitter handle, as you can see right here, and pull in the actual Twitter profile picture to my list, I was able to do that just using column formatting. And this is still just list data. We can also override the entire row. And none of this is compiled. This is not compiled code that needs to get installed. I literally have access to put this column formatting and view formatting definitions directly at the list level. And so what does it look like if we do list format or view formatting? I can override the entire row. So here I've actually connected out to Google, showed a map, created a button, pulled in the profile picture, and this is all just using list data. I've not changed anything. I've not installed any degree of compiled or packaged code. And there's all kinds of samples that you have access to in that GitHub repository. Tons. This is one of my favorite features of the modern experience because it's so powerful. And it doesn't really require any degree of real functional JavaScript or programming. There is a little bit of a curly brace feel behind it when you create the JSON, but Microsoft's creating interfaces to help create more of a wizard for that as well. So definitely check out list formatting. It's extremely powerful. All right, deployment options. When you go deploy your SharePoint Framework solutions, you can deploy them to a tenant app catalog, which makes them available to everyone and all sites, or you can actually scope them to a site collection. So if you're doing development and you don't want that to be available to everybody, you might have a development-only website that you're working with, then you can actually install it just at a site collection level. So it's great for development site collections in a single tenant. You have provisioning using site designs. I know this is a hot topic right now. I won't get too much into this. Bo has a lot of information. Check out his website. He's done a lot of speaking events on that, so he's very passionate around that. So definitely check that out. Debugging. So you may say, okay, great, I've got my web parts out there in the wild, they're working, but there's an error on a page. How do I determine that? How do I figure it out? What's cool is when you actually spin up your gulp serve, if you actually do that in your local environment, what happens is it creates a local web server for you when you're doing development, and that's how you can test it. Well, if a web part or extension is running in production, you can actually apply this query string parameter onto your URL, and it tells SharePoint, for your browser instance only, go look at your local server, which means your computer that you're developing on. So if you need to do debugging and you need to do some console logging to something that lives in production, you can do that. No one else is going to be affected. So any other users, they are not going to be affected. You are telling SharePoint only for this browser instance by way of this argument to go look at your file or your local host for the manifests that load the SharePoint Framework solution. So extremely powerful for debugging. You may need to know what SharePoint Framework web parts are out in your tenant. This is a blog post by Bo. Again, it'll be in the it's in the notes of the slide deck, so we'll make sure that that gets available to you guys. This is using search to go find where your SharePoint Framework web parts are being used throughout your tenant. So it's extremely powerful. The last thing is application insights. This is a feature that's available through Azure that allows you to track things like request rates, response times, exceptions and errors. Essentially, it's analytics and allows you to utilize analytics on your particular tenant and site. So we covered a lot of tips. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I know we're right a little over, so I apologize for that. But feel free to reach out to myself or Bo on any of this information. Like I said, I'll get you the notes and the slide deck on this. But hopefully you got at least one or two things out of this. We covered a lot of ground, but there's hopefully one or two things you got that you weren't aware of that will help you in your SharePoint day-to-day job. Thank you guys for listening.
Anybody has any questions for David?
Yeah, it's Gary. I've got a couple of questions. Hopefully I won't keep you too long. It's been, well, it's a perfectly timed session for me because I'm literally about to get back into SPFX after about a year. So it's been a good refresher from that point of view. One of the things that you didn't touch on was SPFX, but on-premise. So like SharePoint 2016 or 2019. And I guess the kind of the question to ask is, obviously SharePoint Online gives you everything, everything's configured. Do you know of any kind of like minimum requirements for SharePoint Framework on-premise?
Yeah, so you do lose a lot for on-prem. So like, for example, list formatting, you have access to some of that. So things like column formatting is available, but I don't think view formatting is. Or, for example, SharePoint 2019 only supports up to a certain version of SharePoint Framework, which I think is 1.6.2 for SharePoint 2019. So they've got that documented, but yeah, you are kind of hamstrung by that because they 2019 was essentially a copy paste of one day not too long ago, right? If you will, they kind of forked it. Yeah. But yeah, you have to really kind of do a little due diligence each time you go to build something to think about, okay, what do I have access to that maybe I've grown comfortable having access to in SharePoint Online, but now this is not available to me in SharePoint on-prem.
Yeah, yeah. So like the different versions and stuff. I was thinking more along the lines of obviously kind of like what's the SharePoint framework is kind of like still using the old app model, or not old, but the app model kind of approach for deployment and things like that. I was thinking more along the lines of that kind of side of it. So, you know, in terms of SharePoint Server 2019 forms need to be set up for SharePoint apps for SharePoint framework to work. Do you know anything around that?
Yeah, you still set up an app catalog and all of that. It's not as messy, I think, as the add-ins model was. That was messy, and then it never really felt like a true solution because things were running through iframes and all that stuff, right? Which always made me kind of like, oh, is that the payoff? But that's the nice thing about Framework, right, is it truly is a first-class citizen running on the page.
Yeah.
But yeah, you still have the scaffolding around the app catalog and all of that.